Chapter 10 is about global inequality. The objectives will be to define global inequality and stratification, to explain global patterns, and then talk about modernization and dependency theory. Global inequality is where wealth is concentrated in certain nations, and that concentration may be distributed unequally amongst the world's people, leading to global stratification. And so, in our human society, the burden of poverty is placed in certain segments of the Earth's population, and I will explain that in some of the other slides. Countries are divided into three categories. We will be using one set of terminology. The book actually describes different ways of looking at these countries, but we will be using high income nations, middle income, and low income. High income nations contain one out of every four people, so 23%. However, we receive 75 cents of global wealth. This means that we have an exceptionally high standard of living. Every country has its issues. The issue for high income nations is that there is a flight of capital from one nation to another, meaning, for example, that a corporation may be making a lot of profits from we high income nations, but instead of paying taxes on that profit, they might decide to uh, go and put their money somewhere else so that they don't have to declare their profits. And so these high income nations don't receive that income. And what happens as well is that no new jobs are open to replace jobs that are lost to other countries. So, for example, if I am Levi Strauss and I used to pay in South San Antonio $20 or 30 hours an hour for someone to make my pair of jeans, but I go and take this job to India, and there I pay $40 a month to have these pairs of jeans be sewn or made. I will take my job over there because I can access the world's population to make the greatest profit. Middle income countries contain most of the world's people, and they receive 23 cents of the global income, or 23%. So for every dollar, they receive 23 cents. The standard of living, even though they receive 23 cents for every dollar, is still above average. So they're living very well. And the issue with them is that they have a challenge in paying off money that they borrow from the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. And so there are strategies to get countries in debt, just like there are strategies to have people inside the United States be go into debt. These are also there are also strategies for middle income countries, and when they get into debt, that means that the whole population then is responsible for paying back this money. And when they can't, then the mechanisms are then set in motion to either take over public waters, take over oil, take over education. And so that's these countries then become poorer when they're not able to pay off their debt. Low-income countries then contain 17% of the world's people, and for every dollar, they only get 1 penny of the global income. So they have a very low standard of living. These individuals are in absolute poverty, which means that they may not have access to clean water, they may not have access to food and nutrients. And so, in worldwide, women are the ones that tend to bear the burden of poverty, and they tend to bear the burden because in certain countries they are not valued. Sometimes you have countries that value women less than cattle, and or women are considered only breeders who are only capable of having children. And when a woman is devalued so much, she may be forced to procreate children that she doesn't want to because there may not be access to birth control. And when she is faced with having so many children, she may sacrifice herself to be able to feed her children. So now we're talking about global wealth and patterns of poverty. I had mentioned earlier absolute poverty. Absolute poverty is individuals who cannot get the basic needs that they need for survival. So, not having access to food, clean water, or safe housing. This type of poverty is very dangerous. This is where we may see images of children who are malnourished. Relative poverty is different in that you have individuals that are living in very wealthy countries. However, they are barely able to afford some of the basic necessities. They may be helped by their country to have food stamps or access to living, certain standards of living, but they are still by the comparison the very wealthy people in that society, they're still below average because they are not able to come up to the level of everybody else. And in 2011, there were 3 billion, or almost half the human population, living on less than $2.50 a day. So what are some theories regarding poverty? Colonialism is the process of wealthy nations exploiting nations that are less wealthy. And so extreme social inequality tends to distribute wealth unequally worldwide. The United States, yes, as it continues to perpetrate its own belief systems all over the world, it has a small percentage of the world's people, but it contains the largest percentage of the world's wealth. Now, it doesn't mean that everyone in the United States has that wealth. The wealth is likely concentrated in a very few people, as we had mentioned, the 1%, and it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone in the society actually is sharing in the wealth. So colonialism is this process of oppressing other people and taking their resources so that I, as a high income nation, can live well. So neocolonialism is this pattern of exploitation that continues now at the hands of multinational corporations. There's some corporations that are so big that have incomes even greater than many countries, and they're able to implement their agenda onto the rest of the planet. Furthermore, extreme gender inequality tends to limit women's ability to get ahead in certain cultures. So, although in high income nations like ours, we have access, currently continue to have access to birth control, there are some countries where women may not know that birth control exists. And if they do know, they may not have the resources to be able to buy these birth control methods. And so cultural belief systems also tend to impact how women experience poverty in the world. There are some countries where women have a very low standing, and although the women tend to biologically be able to live longer than men, in some countries women actually die younger because of the violence that's perpetrated on them. And so we now talk about slavery. Slavery goes hand in hand with these patterns of inequality that are created by wealthy nations and by wealthy individuals inside these middle income or low income nations. Chattel slavery, this is where one person owns another. We have examples here of child slavery and child prostitution. Debt bondage is where the poor pledge themselves as servants and can never pay back their debt, because the pattern is to have a person borrow money and then they come and work, and the salary that they earn is way below what they owe. And so the person may end up finding themselves owing more and more and never being able to pay back that debt. We have examples being human trafficking, child labor, and servile marriage. In some countries, because there's so much violence, some families may decide to marry off their children to adults. It usually happens that it's young girls to marry to older, much older men. And so this is a part of debt bondage. So, what are some theories regarding the poverty that exists inside the United States and worldwide? Modernization theory says that you have nations that are poor, but they will become similar to we high income nations as they develop technologically. So the idea here is that it's the country who is responsible because they haven't developed the belief systems or the technology that they need to become like high income nations. Dependency theory is on the other end. It basically says that global inequality exists because rich nations continue to exploit poor nations, and it creates a cycle of dependency. So if I force a country to go into debt and they can't pay that debt, then they are dependent on the wealthy nations. And wealthy nations became wealthy because they were actually able to exploit the world's populations and the world's resources. And so dependency theory basically focus on the exploitation that continues today in the form of new colonialism.